I represent essentially the small family foundations, of which there are probably around 50,000 of them in the country. They're very different from the larger institutional. Okay, thank you. From the larger institutional foundations, primarily run by the families on the board. So the McIntosh Foundation was founded in 1949, but it didn't receive a permanent endowment until 1971. That was a magic year because that's when the civil rights was in full bloom in this country, and also the environmental movement was just getting started. So we were ambitious enough to try and tackle both. We were young, and we felt that this was a learning curve for us because I was 24, my husband was 35, and we decided that we wanted to work within the system, not outside banging down doors, and that in the old days, we would settle things in the OK Corral with guns. And in our modern time, our society settles its differences with laws that we have passed to govern ourselves. So it made sense to us to try and use the law to the advantages that we could. In the civil rights area, we only were there for a brief time because we discovered we didn't have enough money to do both and be effective, and so that forced us to think in terms of focusing even more narrowly. But in the civil rights, 5 years that we were working there, Charles Evers had been elected the first black mayor in the state of Mississippi, and he was the brother of slain Medgar Evers at the time. And our family had been supporting him outside of the foundation for a couple of years, and we decided that it was important that Charles succeed as a mayor of a small town in Mississippi called Fayette, and he needed the time by building up a little foundation and trying to start putting, sidewalks and sewers and all of that in until he could figure out how to get the federal funding that they, were entitled to. It was important, we felt, for him to succeed and to prove that a black man can run a government in the state of Mississippi, and he very, very ably did that. At the same time, we were also looking at this emerging network of environmental fervor that was going on, and it happened to come across the Ford Foundation negotiating with 6 young lawyers from Duke and Yale who wanted to set up an environmental law firm, a nonprofit environmental law firm. It took them about a year to convince the IRS that they were a charitable endeavor. And so Ford had to wait for that, as did we. But we decided to match Ford, which was a huge amount of money in those days for a small foundation like this. But we also felt that this was really unique, and we liked the idea of beginning to develop public interest law. So we left the civil rights after Charles's successes and moved in to partnering with Ford in founding NRDC, which is Natural Resources Defense Council. We accepted that we needed to limit our focus because we had limited resources. We believed in working within governance, and that we know and understood that we needed to take risk in order to try new things and not be afraid of that and not be afraid of failure. We continue to believe that public interest law is an important, effective strategy, and we have stayed in that field for 45 years so far. I want to give you some examples of the effectiveness that the law can have in bringing about systemic change. And that's always been our goal, is to take the smallest amount of money that we could, go out long-term, use the law to our greatest advantage, and if we won, it would affect the greatest number of people. There was a 1976 Tax Reform Act that attempted to stem tax abuses and to make lobbying efforts more equitable. But what it actually also did was severely restrict charitable giving. And it was when a lot of our foundations were beginning to move into advocacy of the environment. And that is what we had done too. So literally all of the not-for-profit environmental organizations that we were supporting were advocates and were lobbying. So this meant that we would lose our tax-exempt status if we chose to continue supporting the NRDCs and the Earth Justices of this world. We didn't think that was right, and there was no one around, sort of beating down the bushes to take on the IRS, so we decided to do it ourselves. And we appealed to the IRS and asked them for a ruling that would allow us to continue giving to NRDC, with the implication that if you didn't allow us to do that, we would take you to court, and we considered it a constitutional issue. Within a year, the IRS came back to us, and in December, I think it was December 8th, 1977, we received a private ruling letter from the IRS informing us of what has since become known in tax law as the McIntosh Ruling, and it stands today. But what it did is that it then gave all the rest of our foundation community the opportunity to go ahead and fund what they were funding without fear of the IRS taking their status. Clearly, that was a decisive action that did not cost a great deal of money. We were we did it privately with attorneys, but it had a huge impact on the philanthropic sector. Now, we're all familiar with how land conservation has been developed in our country over 100+ years. We have an enormous amount of land in the form of national forests, national parks, BLM lands, and national monuments, along with our vast coastal marine estuaries and sanctuaries. We decided to focus on Alaska because it held the largest temperate rainforest in the northern hemisphere and the largest forest system out of our whole federal system. 17 million acres. We have about 58+ million acres in our forest system. That's just the forest. That's not BLM. That's not the others that I mentioned of land. But our theory was, if we can effect good forest management in the Tongass National Forest, then those practices would filter down to the rest of the forest system naturally. The Tongass, unfortunately, was a real political football and has been for many years. Let me see if I can give you a picture. This is what we're looking at in the Tongass. It's spectacular land, and it's meant to be available to all generations. And it was our mission, really, to try and affect change there, because we happen to love trees, truth be known. And the way we wanted to do that was through the law. And so our foundation diligently worked on bringing sound management practices. Since the 70s, our theory was always, as I said, to solve the largest system problems, and that would filter down. Where that IRS case that I just talked to you about took less than a year, the Roadless Rule Act, which was passed in 2001, which has been a political football for 14 years, was finally resolved last November at the Supreme Court level, and we won. And a little bit of an explanation on that: the Roadless Rule was put was made a law under the Clinton administration to stop all federal building of roads in national forests. And the bill, unfortunately, Clinton made a deal with Ted Stevens of Alaska that the Tongass would be exempt from it. Not a good idea, not fair. And so naturally we funded, through Earth Justice primarily, litigation that started right after that, challenging the ability to exempt anything from an overall law like that. We won that finally in November, and I was going to walk you through what a law case like that entails, but I think you might be bored with that. So instead of doing that, what I thought I'd do is also mention a few other cases that have been seminal to the development of the environmental movement over this time. When NRDC was established, and we were able to partner with the Ford Foundation, they all of a sudden had plenty of money and some time to begin to explore how to use the law on forestry issues. And they brought a case called the Monongahela case in West Virginia. And the Monongahela forest was being literally clear-cut right down to the bone, just being savaged. And I'll show you what I think a clear-cut looks like. This is in Alaska. The trees are much bigger here than they were in West Virginia. But in any case, an intern, a good friend of mine, was working there, and he discovered a law from 1869 that said I'm sorry, that's my phone doing that. So sorry. Every tree that is cut in a national forest had to be marked and designated first. Well, what that meant was they had to axe a tree and mark it some way, and they couldn't go through and clear cut anymore. So it shut down clear cutting across the whole forest system for a full year. Naturally, Congress came in, took out the law, just got rid of it, and they were able to go back and do it. But that 1 year was very important in the scheme of things as NRDC was developing legal strategies around how to stem the tide of what was going on. And so in that year, they were able to begin to build some other cases that would be precedent-setting, that would begin to solidify the acts that have been put in place in Nixon's administration. And Nixon should get credit, and unfortunately it's overshadowed by Watergate, but he's the one under his administration in which we were all just flying because the laws that we were making at that time, the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, the Endangered Species Act, those were all done in Nixon's time, and they were all done in a very compressed period of time, and we were all giddy because it was just amazing. And these same lawyers were not just litigating at that point, they were helping Congress to write those acts. And so the NRDCs and the Earth Justices of this world were a little bit on the inside writing those laws to begin with. I really believe in the law. I think it's important to hold the line, and if you look at what's happening today of a three-pronged stool, we have the executive branch, we have Congress, and we have the courts. It's up to us to use the courts to try to protect what we have in place and have had in place for 40 years. And that is where really the grounds are going to be for the next 4 years at least. I'm going to close with a quote by Tom Waldo, who is the lead attorney at Earth Justice on the Roadless Rule case. He said, "The remaining wild and undeveloped parts of the Tongass are important wildlife habitat and vital to local residents for hunting, fishing, recreation, and tourism, the driving forces of the local economy. There was no sound reason to exempt the nation's largest and wildest national forest from a common sense rule. Our lessons learned from this experience: not to be afraid to take a risk and always try new strategies, invest in leadership and build capacity through unrestricted grant making, which is all we do. We never restrict anything. Focus on a long-term objective and stay the course. 14 years is a long-term objective. Don't burden young organizations with paper demands. That's become a problem. Serve on boards and share one's business acumen, which my husband and I both had, and we have both served on a multitude of environmental boards. And lastly, be entrepreneurial." Thank you.